the J-10 jet and whether or not aircraft were actually shot down by Pakistan to India. I'm sure you could see where this is going. But did this happen? If so, how many? What does this tell us about Chinese military capability? Because I think it's obviously not, it's not like the world has completely changed, but I do think it's an illustration that the Chinese are developing military capacity in a way that we might have underestimated. Am I wrong here? Talk me through these matters.
The Chengdu J-10 and the PL-15 air-to-air missile, both Chinese platforms employed by Pakistan, did appear to have some important tactical effects, right? And again, early days, we don't have a full public accounting, at least authoritative public accounting of aircraft losses, particularly on the Indian side. But I think we can fairly confidently say at this point, at least based on the evidence that we've seen, based on reporting from French aircraft manufacturer Dassault, that India did lose at least one Rafale.
This is the Global Gambit. How's it going, everybody? Welcome back. This is a conversation about India and Pakistan, of which I myself am very well aware the polarization and, shall we say, intense scrutiny that is existing right now on both sides of this situation and everywhere in between. Some of you have been displeased with my own videos that I have produced, but the emphasis here is that one tries to acknowledge without necessarily endorsing issues at hand. And someone who I was very interested to have their perspective on was Ankit Panda. Ankit Panda is, I think, one of the foremost voices on a lot of different things to do with Asia and nuclear policy. We've had him on the show twice before now. And given his, expertise in nuclear, but also the region more broadly, I thought he would be very well placed. Well, take us through some different perspectives here. And if you disagree with Ankit, then you're free to share those opinions. The point is, though, to do so politely and respectfully. That's all I ask. And if you enjoy the conversation, then consider subscribing. But anyway, Ankit, it's a pleasure to have you back. And very simply, how serious is this situation? A lot of people look at 99. Some people look at the 70s, 60s conflicts. Are we at that level, or already at a reduced escalation because we haven't seen further clashes in the past, week and a bit?
Yeah, sure. So I think this is certainly, without a doubt in my mind, the most serious skirmish between India and Pakistan that we have seen since the 1999 Kargil War. In a lot of ways, of course, this looks very different. I have started to describe this essentially as the first real South Asian crisis of what you might call a third nuclear age. So India and Pakistan both have tried to rewrite the rules of how they compete under the military shadow, primarily India.
Right.
And so what we witnessed was broad, multi-domain aerial combat, including crewed platforms, uncrewed platforms, ballistic missiles, artillery shelling, across the international border on undisputed territory in both sides. So this wasn't just limited to the disputed part of Kashmir, but to the heartland of Pakistan and into the proper territory of India. So really serious crisis. I was genuinely quite concerned before news became public that the United States had facilitated de-escalation. Now, this could have led to a very dangerous conflict between two nuclear-armed neighbors. And I should note here that this is the most intense fighting we've seen between two nuclear-armed states in a nuclear deterrence relationship across multiple domains. So India and Pakistan in 1999 being the other example, and China and the Soviet Union in 1969.
Yeah, the 69 example was what I was thinking of, but certainly, and I mean, I've got a couple of questions about the role of the US and the Trump administration for later on, so people interested, stay tuned for that. But very simply, Ankit, what about this nuclear doctrine element? Because both obviously have the nuclear capacity, but the doctrine of Pakistan is more, from what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's Pakistan will threaten to use nuclear weapons as a deterrence, or they use them as a deterrence measure, both not just in potential strikes in a nuclear capacity from India, but also in kinetic warfare. So that is, disproportionate because they know they can't go toe to toe with India because India's a bigger force, it's got more, overall military might, whatever. Is that true? And what does the calculus there play into the minds of, all involved?
Yeah, sure. So it's helpful to do a little bit of scene setting here. So yes, so both countries have nuclear weapons. They have roughly the same number of nuclear weapons, different force force postures, certainly different strategies, right? And I think you got at a very important difference. What are India and Pakistan respectively trying to accomplish with their nuclear capabilities? For Pakistan, nuclear weapons solve a problem that I think has manifested across multiple wars with India, particularly the experience in the 1971 war, which effectively dismembered the country, cleaved it in two, resulted in the creation of Bangladesh as an independent country. But that was I think, a real crystallization for Pakistan that it faced significant conventional military inferiorities vis-a-vis India, quantitatively and qualitatively. And as the United States did in the 1950s and early 1960s in Europe, as North Korea does on the Korean Peninsula today, Pakistan decided that a very good way to offset that conventional imbalance was to rely on nuclear weapons. And so you're right, Pakistan does have a threshold of nuclear use that is rather low. The traditional messaging from the Pakistanis has been there have been a number of red lines, key thresholds that if they were crossed, big military one being an Indian ground mobilization that enters Pakistan, that would result in the use of nuclear weapons. That's a very credible threat for the Pakistanis. India has a very different posture. No first use. India does not intend or signal that it would use nuclear weapons first because it has conventional superiority vis-a-vis Pakistan. So the reason this is important for understanding this crisis is because on the Indian side, there has been a lot of talk about calling Pakistan's nuclear bluff, in effect, which, I think that goes a little far. But essentially, India has, with this crisis, I think, tried to communicate to the Pakistanis that there is more room than previously believed for the two countries to compete under the nuclear shadow, specifically for India to employ precision-guided munitions and air power in a way that is calibrated and doses punishment to Pakistan in a way that doesn't transgress Pakistan's nuclear red lines. Of course, the concern now is that a new normal has been set, as Narendra Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, put it. And so the next time we do see a terrorist attack from Pakistan-based groups on Indian soil, which is all but guaranteed, there will be another terrorist attack of the kind that catalyzed this crisis, that India will feel the need to up the ante and to use what was learned in this crisis to retaliate the next time. And we might not be as lucky in terms of managing escalation as we were this time.
No, I think it's very important to emphasize that these latest clashes have come about because of the events of April 22nd. And I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, is it Pakistan refers to their nuclear policy as massive retaliation, or it's like they have the first use policy, strike policy, because of their inability to go toe-to-toe with the Indians? Is that how they frame it?
No, so massive retaliation is actually India's policy. The Pakistani, both the Indians and the Pakistanis profess a version of credible minimum deterrence or minimum credible deterrence in terms of the size of their force. Pakistan pursues what it calls full spectrum deterrence, which includes nuclear capabilities of essentially all yields and all ranges, which means very short range. You have a system known as the Nasr, which is an extremely short range ballistic missile, 70-kilometer range, low yield. That's essentially the most credible first use system for Pakistan against Indian mechanized ground forces mobilizing into the country. And then you have the Shaheen 3 and the Ababil, which are longer range ballistic missiles, the Ababil with multiple warheads. And also full spectrum deterrence speaks to Pakistan's ongoing conventional military modernization, which I think is an underappreciated part of what we've just seen, which is that the Pakistanis were perhaps more capable than India might have expected in a number of capacities, to include here electronic warfare, and in their ability to engage air-to-air with the use of Chinese platforms in particular.
Yes, we're going to come to that as well, because that was one particular place we had a lot of dissatisfaction from some of my viewers. But so Ankit, one specific question, though, is obviously in the case of Ukraine and Russia, we've obviously had a lot of conversation around nuclear doctrine, de-escalate or escalate to de-escalate kind of mindset. But obviously also tactical nukes or non-strategic ICBM potentials. Is this something that, one, either side have, or two, developing, and three, could use, or it doesn't apply in this context?
So it very much applies to Pakistan. Pakistan has tactical nuclear weapons designed for use on the battlefield. And so the Nasr, that system I described, is a very good example of such a capability. The idea for that system would actually be to potentially even use nuclear weapons on Pakistani soil once Indian forces in a ground mobilization have crossed in. And so obviously an Indian ground mobilization has been a pretty clear threat scenario for the Pakistanis going all the way back to 1999 and the 2001-2002 crisis. and tactical nuclear weapons have been a solution to that particular problem. It's essentially a version of the problem that NATO was trying to deter in Central Europe during the Cold War, when if Soviet tank columns started to pour through the famous Fulda Gap, NATO forces would have used nuclear weapons to degrade the ability of the Soviet Union to prosecute that ground campaign. And so Pakistan has taken a similar approach. So India, in this crisis, did not engage in a major ground mobilization, right? And so that was one of the ways in which India, I think, tried to calibrate escalation. If I had seen that, I think I would have been rather concerned about the possibility of this getting a lot more dangerous than it did. That said, I think the early lessons from this crisis on the use of air power are, by equal measures, somewhat reassuring in that India does appear to have been rather careful and precise with the damage it inflicted on Pakistani targets, but also at the same time, the idea of major nuclear armed countries using air power against each other's territory does open a very dangerous Pandora's box, in my opinion, because escalation dynamics in the air can very quickly spiral out of control, particularly, and we can talk about this, Pakistan apparently started doing something that catalyzed the United States into action very quickly. We don't know exactly what that was. There's been some press reporting, but it does appear to be something that relates to the country's nuclear weapons capability. This is an old Pakistani playbook as well. We saw this in the 1990 crisis, before both countries actually had overt nuclear weapons, but the Pakistanis had developed and weaponized nuclear technology, and they had a small number of nuclear warheads. During that crisis, the Pakistanis moved nuclear assets in a way that would be visible to the United States, which then in turn would, as Vipin Narang put it in his book, catalyze the United States into intervening in the crisis on Pakistan's behalf. And the United States intervened in this crisis. I don't want to say it was on Pakistan's behalf per se, but it was certainly out of an interest in preventing further escalation, including to the nuclear level.
But what is the break? So, okay, let's be a bit more technical about it. What are the operational conditions of either side? When and how did Pakistan develop tactical nukes? Because I feel that they're relatively, I don't know, I'm not a nuclear expert like yourself, but I don't feel they've been as sort of talked about in the past, years of nuclear conversation as ICBMs are. Maybe they're just not as popular in pop culture as sort of the big rockets that sort of in the Cold War kind of era. But if Pakistan has that capability and they have this propensity to feel like they're more at threat from India, then that surely really opens the prospect of one being used in a low yield, performative sort of sense. Somewhere, as you say, within Pakistan's own borders, as a way to off-put India from acting, right? That sounds quite scary.
Well, so look, I mean, it's something that received quite a bit of conversation a few years ago. I mean, they started developing these weapons during the 2000s after initially deploying air deliverable nuclear weapons. Those were the first, and ballistic missile deliverable nuclear weapons that were strategic systems. This was part of essentially a process of what you might call light modernization in South Asia. Both India and Pakistan have adapted and deployed new delivery systems over their mutual coexistence as nuclear neighbors for now more than a quarter of a century. That said, the broader point that you make, though, about not hearing a lot about South Asia is, I think, a broader problem in the Western discourse now, because as you know, while the global nuclear landscape has become a lot more dangerous, you have competitive great power dynamics, a lot of interest in Russia and Ukraine, and India and Pakistan, which were once the poster children for the risks of nuclear proliferation and the so-called great nuclear tinderbox of the second nuclear age, have somewhat fallen off the agenda, right? Until there's a crisis, the world doesn't really pay attention much to India and Pakistan's military capabilities or nuclear capabilities. And that's exactly what we've seen now, right? The last time we had a crisis was Balakot in 2019, when the world again woke up and remembered that India and Pakistan have nuclear weapons and are throwing punches at each other. And so that does remain a significant risk. But look, I mean, I want to be very precise about the point at which nuclear weapons become salient in a crisis, right? I do not see evidence that Pakistan was readying the use of nuclear weapons. What I do think likely happened, and this is admittedly a bit of speculation, but informed speculation based on that historical case study that I described, and also if you read between the lines in some of the press reporting, India struck significant Pakistani air bases. So Nur Khan Air Base outside Rawalpindi and Sargodha Air Base near Kirana Hills, the nuclear weapon storage site. The storage site itself, there's again, we're having this conversation very early. The fog of war is still dissipating. There is still uncertainty about what exactly was hit, what the damage, what precisely was damaged. There's some unconfirmed videos that Kirana Hills was hit. There's been some reporting in the Indian press. I do not at the moment see smoking gun evidence that leads me to believe that India deliberately targeted Kirana Hills, which is a weapon storage site. But nevertheless, if you're Pakistan and you have air deliverable nuclear weapons and India is starting to attack your air bases and trading, it appears the Indians targeted a hangar at Nur Khan for aerial refueling aircraft, and unconfirmed reporting about whether an AWACS airborne warning and command and control aircraft was also hit. But anyways, the responsible thing to do, what any nuclear armed country would do that relies on aircraft, would be to move things around, right? Which is to disperse your nuclear capable aircraft. Pakistan declared an airspace closure over the whole country into the final day of the crisis. But not just move your aircraft, potentially even start moving your nuclear weapons around, which is exactly what happened in 1990. And if Pakistan did that, it is, I have no doubt that the United States would be able to detect that fairly quickly and reliably. And then you might imagine the United States sharing that intelligence with India, communicating that the U.S. has serious concerns. Something clearly changes because you have the American Vice President, J.D. Vance, going from saying that the crisis is, quote, fundamentally none of our business to a day later working the phones to Narendra Modi. So that, I think, is the salience of the nuclear question here. As far as I can see it, it's not that they were getting ready to use nuclear weapons. Nothing was happening in India as far as I can tell, right? India was not engaged in any nuclear signaling. There's no reason for India to do that. That's not how India's nuclear doctrine or posturing works. But that's the extent of it at the moment, which is not to say that it wasn't serious. I mean, again, anytime you have nuclear armed countries in a conventional war, the danger of nuclear use has risen compared to the pre-war baseline. But I think it's important to not be hyperbolic about the risks here as well.
Yeah, certainly. That's why I wanted to have you on, because we could talk about NATO, Russia, we could talk about China, US, which I do want to come to a little bit in a moment. But of any country or situation in the world, which is why I talk about it on the show, right? People criticize me because I'm a Westerner looking in on an issue, and it's like, your propaganda or it's like, well, no, this is, for me, the single biggest potential hotspot anywhere in the world. These two are right next to each other. They have nuclear weapons because of their precise antipathy to one another, and all these elements. The sheer unpredictability of how we can go from one point on the escalation ladder to a whole nother is very much there. But to your point, I think that's a really, really, I really want to underscore that bit about Vance, because I think he's getting a bit of a wake-up call about what it actually means to be a senior member of a government, not just talking about, well, this is what I want to see. He's actually like, oh, shit, we have to respond to this crisis now in an area of the world I've never been to or don't care much about. I know his wife comes from India, I believe. So that was quite revealing. But when it comes to the United States' capacity to influence either of the capital's strategic decision making, what is that? Because it isn't Afghanistan anymore. America isn't directly on the ground. It doesn't have the relationship with Pakistan. India seems to be much more. Well, Modi is incredibly influential for many Indians, and his own desire to be strategically autonomous. Can you break me down a little bit what this current White House administration is feeling about this region, or just generally the US more broadly in its grand strategy in the area?
Nobody in this U.S. administration a few weeks ago, before April 22nd especially, anticipated, I think, a South Asian crisis, right? My sense is that, though, if you've been watching this region and you saw what happened on April 22nd in Pahalgam, the brutal terrorist attack precisely targeting Hindus. I mean, it had a very kind of overtly religious angle targeting civilians, worst civilian attack in India since the 2008 Mumbai attacks. You had to sort of price in Indian kinetic retaliation. And you're absolutely right that this is a very different world from the world we inhabited in 2019, when, you still had a Trump administration in office. And actually that year, the India-Pakistan clashes happened while Donald Trump was meeting Kim Jong-un in Hanoi, Vietnam. And since I do a lot of work on North Korea and on South Asia, that was a week I got very little sleep because I was on the phone with a variety of people, and I sometimes had to remember if I was talking about North Korea or India and Pakistan. But anyways, I mean, the shifts that you've described matter. It also matters that you have a different chief of army staff in Pakistan, General Munir, who is he was enlisted into the Pakistani military under Zia-ul-Haq. He's far more ideological and radical in a number of ways than General Bajwa, the chief of army staff who was in place during the 2019 clash. And I think that did affect Pakistan's willingness to run risks. And then you've talked about Narendra Modi. And I think what you're sort of seeing in your YouTube comment section in terms of motivated nationalist publics on both sides also factors into the escalation dynamics, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, these are two countries with deeply passionate bases of support for their militaries, for their political leadership to inflict costs. And so you have the logic of what escalation management demands, and then you have the logic of retribution, inflicting punishment, showing that your air force is better than the other guy's air force. And if you just looked at what media on both sides were saying, what social media nationalists were sort of promoting, you have extremely permissive conditions, essentially, in the Prime Minister's office in New Delhi and in Rawalpindi for the Pakistani military to run risks. And I think that does affect the way in which this crisis did play out. That said, I will also point out here, though, that messaging on both sides, official messaging, well, there was a difference in official messaging, which is that Pakistan, I think, was a lot looser. There was this fairly ridiculous claim, I think, on the third day of the crisis that India had carried out a false flag ballistic missile attack on Amritsar in Punjab, which just was just not credible in any real sense. Meanwhile, you had sort of Indian messaging that was more measured and calibrated, in my opinion, than what we saw in 2019. Better transparency and lots of language about trying to be non-escalatory. Of course, your enemy gets a vote, so you don't get to say that once you've struck deep into Punjab, which the Indians did, that was non-escalatory because you crossed a pretty big threshold that you've never crossed before, since at least the development of nuclear weapons in both countries. So these dynamics matter. The domestic politics in both countries matter. Going back to the role of the United States, the U.S. influence and interests with both countries are very different. The U.S.-Pakistan relationship is much worse than it was in 2019. The U.S.-India relationship is good, but again, I think if you look at the ceasefire and the way in which that was announced, I think India hasn't been too happy. You could make the case that they got Zelensky'd in a way, in the sense that the United States presented that ceasefire to the world in a way that would really be, I think, deeply objectionable to many of India's traditional positions on how bilateral disputes with Pakistan should be handled, which is bilaterally and strictly on the basis of discussing terrorism and the Kashmir issue. And you had Marco Rubio kind of tweeting that both countries would meet in a neutral location to talk about the full set of issues in their bilateral relationship, which is just like a nightmare for India, because that is not what India wants to see. They don't want the U.S. to intervene externally and be seen as a big player here. But Donald Trump does want that, right? He wants a win. He hasn't been able to get his Ukraine ceasefire. He hasn't been able to bring peace to the Middle East. He hasn't been able to get his Iran deal. And so why not try to take a win with an India-Pakistan ceasefire? And so I think that too, I think, adds to the complications that we've seen here.
Indeed. No, I mean, my question was a little bit long-winded or fluffy in its execution, but yeah, simply I was just interested in how the US relations with both and the broader region at large has evolved, obviously vis-a-vis China, and that brings me to the elephant in the room, or dragon in the room, which is China, because, well, I'm going to very simply ask the question, which is what got lots of people debating, which is, I think it's quite an interesting development, but the J-10 jet, and whether or not aircraft were actually shot down by Pakistan to India. I'm sure you could see where this is going. But did this happen? If so, how many? What does this tell us about Chinese military capability? Because I think it's obviously not, it's not like the world has completely changed, but I do think it's an illustration that the Chinese are developing military capacity in a way that we might have underestimated. Am I wrong here? Talk me through these matters.
Yeah, look, I mean, so the Chengdu J-10 and the PL-15 air-to-air missile, both Chinese platforms employed by Pakistan, did appear to have some important tactical effects, right? And again, early days, we don't have a full public accounting, at least authoritative public accounting of aircraft losses, particularly on the Indian side. But I think we can fairly confidently say at this point, at least based on the evidence that we've seen, based on reporting from French aircraft manufacturer Dassault, that India did lose at least one Rafale. Extremely expensive new platform. India procured 36 of these fighters for the Indian Air Force. And there's a narrative here that has already popped out, which is that you had a Chinese air-to-air missile shoot down a French 4.5 generation fighter. Therefore, China has arrived on the world stage. I think it's a little premature to really draw that conclusion. There's a lot we don't know about the extent to which the electronic warfare environment was conducive to that engagement, whether or not operator error might have been implicated in this, whether the Indian Air Force's concept of operations for what was a standoff strike, right? These were not Indian aircraft that entered Pakistani airspace, as best as I can tell. How that ended up affecting the ability of that platform to successfully engage with the incoming Indian aircraft. But there's going to be a more complicated, I think, accounting here for what precisely did play out. What I will say, though, is if you're China, this will be, I think, a really, really useful set of data points in terms of refining potentially the performance of the PL-15 and potential successor platforms, the electronic warfare capabilities as well that might have been useful against this European capability. And I will point out, too, for the French, this is going to probably affect some of the conversations in Europe about a Euro deterrent, because ultimately the Rafale is, well, I mean, there are differences between the Indian Rafales and the French Rafales. ESA radars in particular are one feature that I don't believe the IAF had on the precise units used in this campaign. But I would just caution against the kind of promulgation of these narratives that come out in the heat of the moment, as tends to be the case with the J-10 and the PL-15. But as analysts, I think I'll be looking at this closely in the years and months to come, particularly once we have a much better picture of what exactly transpired over these 4 days last week.
So, well, are you insinuating that the conflict is well, over, but it's subdued, it's drawn down enough? Because from what I've seen in the past couple of days this week, Modi has reiterated that they're not done. Operation Sindoor is not over. Or is that more just rhetoric to deter Pakistan, or what's going on there?
No, look, I mean, I think with the ceasefire, and there were ceasefire violations after the ceasefire was announced by the Pakistani side, but largely I think both sides ended up bargaining for more escalation than either of them intended with the first round of kinetic strikes. So the start of Operation Sindoor on the Indian side, the Pakistani retaliation, I think both countries ideally would have terminated the crisis at that moment. That's not what happened, and I think both are going to be pleased to be in this position of de-escalation. We should also note here that India's integrated air and missile defense system performed rather well against a range of incoming threats, ballistic missiles, drones, and the like. But India also has a strong incentive in not allowing this crisis to get too protracted, because these systems don't have infinite magazines. There is some point at which your interceptors start to deplete downwards, and that raises some uncomfortable questions about your peacetime readiness for greater escalation with Pakistan, escalation with China. And the other factor is that, the loss of a Rafale here, I think, also speaks to this idea that if India is going to rely on more advanced, technologically exquisite platforms, it is going to rely on things that are expensive, that it has fewer of compared to legacy Soviet platforms like MiGs and the like. And those are capabilities that I think are not easily expended or risked. And ultimately, you have to be realistic as a political leader or a military planner. Authorizing military operations of this kind does accept a risk of losses. I think that's just a mature way to think about this. And if you are thinking longer term about broadly, deterrence against China, competition with China, spending these kinds of capabilities in terms of inflicting punishment on Pakistan makes sense only up to a point. And so I think the de-escalation that we've now seen is likely going to be somewhat sustainable. Worst case, I think we see intermittent kind of small arms fire, maybe shelling and the like across the line of control in Pakistan, between Pakistani administered and Indian administered Kashmir.
Indeed. But where does this leave us then in terms of the calculus for both? Obviously, depending upon who you ask, those will emphasize that this has been a huge illustration of Indian military might. You mentioned there where they get their military components from. I believe it's been, since 2022, imports of Russian military equipment has plummeted, but it's certainly decreased notably. Israel seems to be growing. France has really replaced Russia, I think. America's has been relatively similar, I think. So, and then obviously China is 80% plus is for the Pakistanis. So what does this do in terms of their considerations? Are they going to change the way that they get the weapons? Are they going to reassess how they approach their nuclear mixture? I'm just curious for your speculative forward thinking thoughts in the next, half a year. next period?
So I think on the Indian side, the really interesting shift that I'm curious about is whether this centers the Indian Air Force, at least in internal budgetary and acquisitions debates. I mean, if you look at Indian defense outlays and spending on acquisition, India has been a ground forces oriented country, right? Fundamentally, the Indian Army has had pride of place in managing deterrence of Pakistan and deterrence of China, with the Navy and the Air Force largely failing, I would argue, over the last several decades, despite India's kind of shifting geopolitical orientation and growing maritime orientation to sort of get resources. So now that the Indian Air Force has really been at the center of these two prominent crises with Pakistan, performed rather well with precision strike platforms, you have to sort of wonder if that will lead to a longer term emphasis of air power. And then in Pakistan, I think this is going to really give a fair bit of confidence to this idea that full spectrum deterrence and the conventional modernization piece of full spectrum deterrence, multi-domain operations, is coming together well. And so, you asked about like the narrative about, which country essentially prevailed here. I think what's really important for de-escalation is that both sides have to feel like they have something to take back and look upon with a degree of pride. And I think India and Pakistan are both in that position. And I think if you read the press in both countries, that is the narrative that is now being promulgated by analysts based in these countries, that both think that the response that was given to the other side was an exhibition of national might and power, that it sort of established new rules of the road. And we saw that after Balakot as well in 2019. And so thankfully, that's, in my opinion, a good thing. Of course, the danger is that longer term, when the next crisis does come, inevitably, it will lead to escalation largely either to the thresholds that we've seen in this past crisis last week, or possibly beyond that, which of course gets us back to the place where we started this conversation, which is nuclear dangers. Those dangers do begin to manifest again.
That is a really nice full circle, but I'm sorry to be a pain. I do want to ask one quick bonus question about China. Like, what are they thinking in Beijing? President Xi is doing quite well relative to where he was, say, a few months ago. Things look to be relatively, well, I don't know, but positive. I don't know the right word to use. Do you think we will see China reacting in a different way, or they're just going to keep on the straight and narrow, focus on the fact that they've got this tariff deal with the US, or they are going to be making some reflections on their military front as well?
So, I mean, the honest answer is I don't know. I have not spoken to a single Chinese analyst since this crisis broke out. So I cannot tell you what is going on in Beijing with any level of authority. But I mean, what I can speculate. I mean, what I can tell you is that South Asia is not a prominent. Yeah, India and Pakistan are not a prominent issues in the strategic debates that play out in Beijing. I mean, especially compared to. I mean, look, I think there will be an appraisal in Chinese military journals about this campaign. I think Chinese military and defense analysts, like those of us in Washington, have been curious about what we've learned from Armenia and Azerbaijan, from Russia and Ukraine, from Israel and Iran, looking at these case studies, and now India and Pakistan, of what essentially at least in the Chinese world, is called sort of informatized warfare, right? This kind of conventional precision strike, reconnaissance strike, if you want to use the Russian term for it, how these are beginning to shape the contours of the modern battlefield. So I think that will be something that the Chinese will scrutinize just as everybody else will. But beyond that, there's not really much I can say here. I don't think it's going to lead to a fundamental recalibration of China's approach with its foreign policy towards either India or Pakistan. Pakistan, of course, being a close partner for China, and India being a more challenging and rivalrous relationship, and I suspect that will remain to be the case.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much, Ankit. It's been a pleasure. You say you didn't know much, but you've made 2 more terms that I need to go and read about. But everyone, that's it from us here. Thank you very much to Ankit, who's a senior fellow at Carnegie Endowment, a Place for Peace, and we'll see you all next time. Take care, everyone.